International Budget Partnership Kenya, which I hope some of you have heard of before, is an organization which focuses on transparency and participation in public finances. And we have been working on the issue of equitable distribution of resources since at least 2012, before the Public Finance Management Act was drafted and before devolution began. And of course that work has accelerated with the coming into effect of key laws implementing the Constitution of 2010 and with devolution. And one of the concerns that we've had in the work that we've been doing for the last several years, with a particular focus on issues of equitable distribution and the revenue sharing formula, which divides money between the counties, is that while the Constitution speaks severally and eloquently about equity in many places, you will find many references to equity as a core value. You will find references to equitable distribution in chapters on devolution, in chapters on public finance, even in reference to the distribution of positions in the security forces. There's a mention of equitable proportions of different communities. So the word equity recurs throughout the Constitution.
I will try to explain a little bit how we think about inequalities, what kind of conceptual framework we have. And I already know that I will not be able to answer the question that was asked about what really equity is. And the reason why I won't do that is because the power of equity as a word, it's precisely the fact that it will never be strictly defined. It's a matter of understanding fairness. And I cannot define fairness. No single one of you can do that. It's a negotiation between us. And that subjective assessment is the power of this concept. Is the fact that we cannot refer to it as an artificial definition of poverty, for instance, in which some people can decide that Mamadou is no longer poor, even if he doesn't necessarily feel like they. You cannot do that with equity, because if each of you doesn't feel that he or she is treated equitably, that definition doesn't count. So I think there is in this a very powerful, process-oriented need for negotiating that concept across society. And that subjectiveness of the concept is exactly what provides power to it. The fundamental entry point of the descriptive approach is averages are not useful in understanding reality. It's something that my grandfather used to tell me, you know, when I was studying economics. I'm a strange animal, by the way. I studied economics, and it took me a lifetime almost to get over it, you know. So I then had to study another degree of veterinary medicine, so I am also a vet. And I actually have a PhD in animal health, so really tried to get away from that economic training. And when I was studying economics, my grandfather used to tell me, so what are you studying today? Statistics. I don't trust statistics. And he used to tell me the very old story of the chicken, you know. I don't trust statistics because if you have eaten a chicken and I haven't eaten any, according to statistics, we have eaten half chicken each. And if tomorrow I decide that I eat 2 chickens and you continue to eat 0 chickens, we actually have eaten 1 chicken and you actually have improved your situation. And I think for some reason that history of the chicken, you know, of my grandfather stayed with me. But it may sound something we laugh about, but in the way in which we are presented GDP statistics, they are really talking about that chicken, in the kind of growth that this region had, both aggregate and per capita. So this is important. We use inequality because first and foremost helps us distinguish reality, understand reality better. And by doing so, and by having a multidimensional approach, we expose those structures of power, because certain localities, certain social groups are hit by multiple levels of inequalities. Now, every approach has a pathology, as my medical hat that comes into place. What are the pathologies of this descriptive approach? Data disaggregation might become a perfect tool for blindness. Why that? Because, you know, if you push the disaggregation argument to a point that you disaggregate and disaggregate and disaggregate, at some point we reach Mary, you know? And there's a point in which in 5 million people we have 5 million different charts. So there's a level in which data, if pushed to the extreme, is no longer useful. And part of that is that idea of objective measurement. You know, when it comes to inequality, objective measurement is very complicated to achieve. Now, what do we do with the descriptive approach? This is where the analytical approach comes in. Once we have distinguished, we need to understand what is the relationship between the two tails, or anyway, the different groups of our inequality analysis. And what we expose in this, that very often poverty, as we define it, is a necessity within our current patterns of growth. Because in many ways, the drivers of inequalities and the drivers of prosperity tends to be the same. You know, you're talking about cheap labor, cheap energy, cheap natural resources. Those are both drivers of prosperity for few, as well as drivers of poverty for others. And, you know, unfortunately, when you take the example of the relative role that the flour industry has in this country, and the particular conditions of labor within that industry, you immediately see what I mean when you're talking about the nexus between prosperity and poverty. So there's something, in a sense, powerful about this, because it makes you interrogate your pattern of growth and pattern of economic and social development from a perspective which is not only that of crossing a line. You know, a lot of the poverty approach, in many respects, and I'm not, of course, speaking about all the goodwill that is in having developed it, has focused all of us on crossing a line. No matter how sophisticated you make that line, you know, whether you take income poverty or you take a multidimensional poverty index, still we are talking about crossing a line. Without necessarily investigating what else happens in the broader society. The inequality approach doesn't allow us to do that, because it forces us to consider poverty and marginalization in the context of the broader socio-economic development and understand to what extent the two are linked. The other important element of the analytical approach goes back to that analysis of power structures. Because when you analyze power structures, and therefore you see that social groups are hit by similar and multiple types of inequalities, you also realize the limits of sectoral policies. Because if you take a sectoral policy and you think that you're going to change the condition of small farmers or small fisher folks only by addressing their market access, for instance, or only by accessing, you know, improved education, one single piece, fundamentally, it would be very, very difficult to change the nature of that power structure that they suffer within society. And this also means that the matter of inequality, therefore, is not a matter of social and economic policy. It's a fundamentally matter of governance. And this, in a sense, where the game begins, and what links to what Jason was saying on the importance of understanding, implementing, and going beyond, to some extent, the constitutional provision. This is why the Constitution is so important into that. because it is fundamentally a matter of governance. It's not a matter only of sectoral socioeconomic policies. Now, even this approach has its pathologies. First of all, there is what I call a replace-all approach. The many organizations, many communities within our sector, I'm not talking about Kenya here, I'm taking a global perspective. They basically have decided that inequality is the word to go, is the buzzword of today. So what they've done is they've selected all their documents, they did replace all, and whenever they had poverty, you replace and put inequalities. And you are good to go. Now, and you know, you're laughing about this, but you know, Mary knows what I'm talking about when we deal with country researches on inequality. It's impressive how much many organizations simply want to think that, you know, poverty is inequalities and therefore we are talking the same thing. In reality, we are not, because if we continue to be focused only on the bottom end of our distribution, we're not talking inequalities, even if you use the language. But this is domesticating the language. The second issue is the use of inclusion. A lot of people saying, well, you know, we need to address inequalities by ensuring inclusive something, inclusive growth, inclusive whatever you like to include. Now, the problem with inclusion is that the workers in Naivasha, in the factories, flower factories, are included. It's not that they are excluded. What is the point? Is the terms of inclusion are not equitable. So, inclusion from equity. The moment you do that, you fundamentally consolidate and ossify marginalization. And this needs to raise our alarm bell when these days there's no single development conversation at any level that doesn't mention inclusive in just about every other sentence. There is a problem with that. The extent to which we do not challenge what are the terms of inclusion. Let me explain this a bit. You see, I talked about the distinction between equity and inclusion. So imagine for a moment a typical Cartesian diagram, you know, where you have equity in the vertical and inclusion, sorry, this got out of the graph, in the horizontal. So you basically forget this because it's a nonsensical one, but you have basically a space here in which you have no inclusion and no equity. No? So if you're there, people are excluded, and of course, therefore, if they are excluded, equity sort of doesn't matter. Here, you have a space in which you have inclusion, but that inclusion is in unequitable terms. And then you have a space in which you are able to push for both inclusion and equity. So when we talk about a normative space, we need to understand where it is that we want to locate ourselves into this. Now, in our work within SID, we have identified, therefore, 3 scenarios. There is one scenario in which, you know, the no equity, no inclusion is the winner-take-all situation. Forget about those that are left out. It's me and myself. There is a second scenario in which there is inclusion, but the terms of inclusion are not equitable. And this is one that we call a scenario of social bribery. As much as this is inspired by a lot of goodwill, the reality is that fundamentally, very often, we are bribing the poor. With a little bit of this, a little bit of immunization, a little bit of education, doesn't matter that it won't change your reality, a little bit of health, doesn't matter that it will really keep you healthy, a little bit of income, as long as you can pay for your phone bills, and fundamentally, their situation and their role within the structural power of society doesn't change.
Figures are not always going to be the best thing that we want. And why are they not the best thing that we want at all times? Because if you look at our enrollment figures in Kenya, they are very impressive. Yeah? And these figures is what our policymakers have always wanted to stick with and tell you we have increased enrollment in schools from so low to so high. And so we should celebrate, we should congratulate ourselves. But for the last 6 years, we have gone to schools across the country. In 2014, for instance, we went to all the districts. We count 157 because we went to the census districts, the districts that existed by 2009 when the last census was carried out. So we went to these districts. We visited 4,441 schools. We went to 62,000 households, and we assessed 135,000 children who are aged 6 to 16. And we are trying to ask a simple question: are our children learning? Yes, they are going to school. Yes, we have put so much money in education in the country. So are the children learning? The unfortunate answer is no. They are attending school, they are going through the system, and they are not learning. These poor learning outcomes are also not equitably distributed. They are inequitably distributed. And we have gaps between socioeconomic groups. Yeah. We will see that as we go along. And these are important for inequity right now and for inequity in the future. Are all our children included in education? People will tell you, with free primary education, yes, but we still have over 11% of children who should be in school out of school. That is what our data shows. But even with the data that shows only 11% are out of school, when we test class 3 children using class 2 syllabus, only 3 out of 10 can actually do class 2 work. They have finished class 2, but 7 out of 10 just went through class 2. They didn't learn what they should have learned in class 2. So are all our children included? Do they have that opportunity to partake of education? The government has allocated 300 million to infrastructure development in the national schools. It has allocated 150 million to all the others. Out of 7,000 schools, secondary schools in the country, only 114 are national. Yeah? What percentage of our children are they educating? Those national schools, in the first place, have been privatized. They have been taken over by the rich. They are out of reach by the poor children, however bright, because the fees is at least 100,000 per year. So first of all, these are schools with parents who can subsidize. These are schools with very good infrastructure. But these are the schools receiving close to 70% of government funding for schools' infrastructure development. And they are educating less than 20% of the children. So do the remaining 80% have equitable access to quality education? We looked at a number of things, and we looked at enrollment in the country. We have given the results as per county, and you can see that Marsabit has the lowest enrollment rate, and we have Kirinyaga with the highest at 92%. So there is still a gap of 25 percentage points there. Even when we talk about enrollment, which we are very proud of, children in Marsabit are far less likely to be in school compared to their counterparts in Kirinyaga. We looked at some of the competencies that these children are acquiring, and we are testing them in math, English, and Kiswahili. And you can see that consistently math is performed worse than English and Kiswahili. Kiswahili does better. But the best county remains Nyeri. and the worst is Mandera, with a very huge gap in their achievement, to the extent that a child in Nyeri, a class 3 child in Nyeri, is 6 times more likely to tackle class 2 work than the child in Mandera and Marsabit. We also checked whether they attend school, between boys and girls, attendance, and the teachers as well. And generally, the children attend school more than teachers. A lot of teachers are not attending school. And here is the catch. We have spoken to some of the teachers, and they have told us, now let us face it. I am a parent myself. Government does not pay me enough to pay fees for my own child. So will I spend all my time here in class while my child stays at home unable to pay fees? Or I will go out there and look for some supplementary income to make sure my own child goes to school. And the most interesting thing that can make a major statement on Kenyan public primary education is the fact that the primary school teachers themselves have their children in private school. I live along Thika Road, yeah, and every morning when I go to work, I see lots of people walking across Thika Road from Madare Valley to Muthaiga. And a thought crosses my mind. These guys are going to Muthaiga to spend a full day watering lawn and flowers using treated water, and walk back to Madare in the evening to drink untreated water. I said that to a colleague one time, and he told me, pray very hard that the people in Madare never think like that. Because if they do, the country will burn. So for how long can we be able to sustain the coexistence of these two circles? The virtuous circle of prosperity, which is small, and the vicious cycle of poverty, which is big and growing.
So some of the tools that we have up here are the diverse set of indicators centered around poverty. So if you click on the downward arrow, you can, I need to update this. At the moment, you're still using $1.25, but I think by the end of early next week, it should be using $1.90 to reflect the current methodology. But we give you indicators on people living less than 1.25, and as a percentage of the population per country who are living below 1.25. We also have indicators around vulnerability. So we have the climate vulnerability indicators, and at the left here we provide the source of the data. So for climate vulnerability, we get it from Endgain Index. This also has vulnerability has sub-indicators under it. So there's natural hazard exposure. So basically your susceptibility to natural disasters, fragile states, and human hazard exposure score. That is from the INFORM database. We have a global picture on the domestic resourcing. So this is government spending per person. The deeper the shade, the lower the government spends. So if you look at Kenya, Kenya spends $619 per person. And let's look at South Africa. South Africa spend about $4,000 per individual. And also in here we have sub-indicators, so government revenue generated per person, total government revenue as a percentage of GDP, and various others. We have data on international resources, so what type of international resource flow is going, the largest chunk are going to countries in the developing south. So you can tell from the Central East Africa, most of the largest international resource flow into this region is primarily ODA. And Angola, they have more long-term debt as an instrument of finance from externally. Here we also have sub-indicators, so there's remittances per person, total international resource flows, foreign direct investment per person as a ratio of national population. You also have data on international official finance flows. We have data on humanitarian finance, and we have some data around data revolution. So, as I said, we are big on promoting data use, and also big on championing better or rather quality data to back up this policy decision.